OpenAI, I think, is the fastest growing consumer product of all time.
We are almost certainly underestimating the impact of generative AI. What it means to be human today is fundamentally different than what it was 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Do you think we're worried too much about those things? Do you think we're not worried enough, or we just don't know?
We are already at war in this information space.
Then there's people in the criminal world that are intentionally creating new identities all the time.
Policing doesn't work because we truly do have enough resources. It's because there is a belief that we should.
Are we going to go through that kind of a change where it redefines potentially citizenship or how people see themselves?
How are we going to feel when we discover that the AI is better at the leadership piece than we are? It's a fundamental shift. There's never coming back.
Welcome to the Siren Investigates podcast. I'm John Randles. This is the podcast that explores the technology and intelligence that allow us to keep people, assets, and networks safe. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Julian Stodd. Julian's a writer, researcher, and founder of Sea Salt Learning, a global consulting firm that helps organizations navigate disruptive forces of social change. He's an author of 17 books, over 2,000 articles, including book titles such as The Social Leadership Handbook, Exploring the World of Social Learning, A Mindset for Mobile Learning, and most recently, The Engines of Engagement, a curious book about generative AI, which we have here. And he's also advised organizations globally like the WHO, Apple, HSBC, Novartis, and he teaches at the University of Pennsylvania Doctoral Chief Learning Officer Program and the Berlin School of Creative Learnership. Julian, welcome to the podcast.
No, thanks for having me along. Yeah.
Excellent. So let's get right into it. In terms of your book and the book title, I think the theme I took from the book is that you don't want this to be a how-to, another list of what you should do with AI. It's really a discussion point. And I love the title, that it's a curious book about generative AI, because most books out there aren't very curious. They're telling you what to think. You know, was that important to you? Is that important that we think about how this technology is coming at us? Just talk us through the title and how you actually came up with that.
Yeah, it is important. My work is very much exploratory. It explores the context of the social age. It looks at how the world is changing around us, but not necessarily through a specific technology or a specific change. It looks at broad patterns of change and hence broad patterns of adaptation. And at the very broadest level, what we're seeing is that our structures of knowing, of learning, our structures of citizenship and belonging, these things are changing. And one thing is very clear, and that is that uncertainty carries a high price. We have created systems in which it seems very important to say that you have all the answers and to say that you're certain what you need to do. It's very difficult to experiment, to explore, to be curious. So when I was talking to I have a little writing group with Dr. Seychatz and Jeff Stead. We meet every Thursday night to explore interesting topics. And at one point, excuse me, I said, I think we should write something about generative AI, but not a book of answers, because I don't have any answers. And I think they thought they didn't have the answers either. So we carefully set out to write a brief for ourselves, which said what we weren't going to write. And we said, let's not do anything about prompt engineering. Let's not do anything about a specific technology. Let's try to broaden our lens and look at what this means for our fundamental structures of knowledge, of truth, of artistry, of citizenship, of belonging, of security. You know, like at the broadest level, what does this mean? Because there's plenty of people that will either tell you or sell you what to do today. But especially at a leadership level and a more strategic level, we need to be thinking, what's changing within the system, but also how is the system itself changing? And that's really what we set out to do.
Excellent. And with this uncertainty, have you seen a lot of fear in the world that it's generating? And, because when things change, people see opportunity, people also see fear with that uncertainty. Have you seen a lot of that in your talks, in your customers, in your engagements? What are you seeing on the fear side?
It, it's interesting. And I try to say it respectfully because I would almost be happy to see fear. What I tend to see mainly is a very tentative, hesitant type of exploration. I tend to see and hear far more repetition of very common themes which are dominant in media coverage rather than exploration to really discover the things we should be worrying about. So that it's not difficult to hear people saying we should worry about bias, we should worry about disinformation, and we should, but we should be really delving into what sits underneath this. People, are fearful and people are liberated, and both of those things are symptoms or are signs of a fundamental change or fracturing in some of the things that we are familiar and confident with. They represent a change in underlying structures of power and control, of knowledge and knowing, of identity and belief and belonging. These things are being assailed, pulled apart by AI. And that really is where I think we should focus. So fear is a useful indicator that we should either sort of retreat and hold back because we'll get burned, or we should build resilience and defend against, or we should lean into and push through. But we need information and understanding of the landscape before we move into some kind of kinetic and defensive or denial-based reaction.
Yeah. And have you ever seen such a fracture in your career to date? Is this the most fractured we're at in terms of an interesting change point?
Yeah. So the simple answer is I would say yes. And I'll give you the three things that I'm focused on at the moment in my own work. But I should also give you the caveat that my practice is held in a principle of working out loud. So I research and I write and I share my work constantly, and failure is part of my practice. So I'm not sharing these as answers. I'm sharing these as sort of three landmarks that I'm seeing as I'm exploring this. But I think my encouragement is that people need to build and document what their own landmarks are. So the three things that I look at are firstly the context of the social age, secondly the reality post-pandemic, and thirdly the rise of AI. So the social age is the core feature of my work, and it says that social collaborative technology has radically connected us and shifted our underlying sociology. So what it means to be human today is fundamentally different than what it was 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Wow.
And specifically, we've upended structures of power and community. We are seeing an evolved relationship between individuals and the structural aspects of society. We inhabit a greater diversity of social systems within a greater diversity of identities within that. That has all sorts of significant impacts. So that's my sort of first answer, is that in itself is probably paradigmatic change. The post-pandemic context is sort of the least significant of the three, but significant in one specific context. And that is that it represents a clear fracturing of the relationship between space and power. So the pandemic pulled us out of formal spaces and structures, moved us forcibly online, and taught us a lesson that we seem very determined not to learn, which is that something we believed was so fundamental to our systems, which was that the control of space and the inhabitation of formal and sanctioned space was central to our ability to operate. But it turns out it wasn't. People
Right.
adapted incredibly fast. And since then, most organizations are persisting in trying to force us back into legacy structures. And, that's a mistake because if we've learned a lesson, if we can see something playing out, we should be reacting to that. But we should also be saying, if something we believed was fundamentally true turned out to be so fragile and
Yeah.
so untrue, what else is that going to be the case for? Like, is citizenship just as ephemeral as the office turned out to be? Is truth, is artistry, is creativity, whatever it is, we need to be thinking in those terms. And hence, so you've got generative, you've got the context of the social age, you've got post-pandemic, and then what AI does is it really fundamentally strips the value out of higher order thinking and sophisticated artifacts. It destroys our notions of truth and creativity and trust, and it completely pulls apart the connection between learning and practice and performance. And when you put all of that together, then you could argue that any one of those three things in themselves could give paradigmatic change. But together, it is a fundamental shift. And I think it requires us, my work says, it requires us to adapt. It requires us to adapt within the systems we inhabit, our systems of government and governance, of organization and productivity, of education, of security. All of those systems need to adapt within themselves. But we almost certainly need to adapt at the more holistic level because we're seeing some of the fundamental structures are also changing. So it's change within the system and change of the system.
Interesting. And if you look at the way you approach this subject, sounds like, and in your writing and talking to you, you're very positive about the change, that you're embracing the change. So, I'm sure you're familiar with the works of people like Max Tegmark and Jeffrey Hinton, who are fearful of what AI will happen when we get to superintelligence and AGI. How do you think of those things? Do you think we're worried too much about those things? Do you think we're not worried enough, or we just don't know?
I think in many ways, we don't yet know enough to even be in denial. So
Okay.
I don't dispute or disagree with any of that. I mean, I'm not saying anything insightful or original to say we are almost certainly underestimating the impact of generative AI. We are, you know, when people ask me what will it change, I say, everything beyond anything we will recognize. I mean, it fundamentally changes that, and it is doing already. What we have to live through is the war. We have to live through the conflict, which is between, firstly, our understanding of the world and the reality of the world. So our understanding is based typically on our experience. We predict based upon precedent. And AI is breaking that relationship. It carries us into ambiguity. And we see that, in industry where organizations are being asymmetrically disrupted. We see it in security, where we're shifting away from sort of direct kinetic conflict to far more distributed and diffused models of conflict. And so we have this kind of change here. We have to sort of look at how the structures of power are being assailed, because power is everything. If you look at a social system and you boil it down and distill it to its bare minimum components, it's really about sort of agency and power.
Yeah.
And power is being not only pulled away from formal structures, but is also moving into a kind of multi-dimensional construct. So what our collaborative technologies and our hyperconnectivity allow us to do is kind of to exist in these different places. We almost inhabit a broader array of spaces, and we can carry different power within those different spaces. So we see some signs of this where we see people delaminating or pulling away from our historic and recognized structures of identity and belonging. But we should also recognize that the emergent structures may directly challenge what came before, or may just abstract or make irrelevant what came before. And this is something that I'm looking at in the book I'm working on at the moment with Dr. Schatz as well, which is called The Unreconciled Self, a planetary philosophy. And it really looks at how we're moving away from our legacy notions of nation into a different type of global relationship. But that's the next.
So does it have parallels to the printing press and the Renaissance, where people got more interested in reading and education? Are we going to go through that kind of a change where it redefines potentially citizenship or how people see themselves?
Yeah, I'm quite sure. I mean, it'll read that and more and faster and in more dimensions. So, that's why I say, should we be fearful? Absolutely, we should be fearful if what we are seeking to do is preserve everything that came before. So if you look at higher education, should universities be fearful? They should have been fearful 10 years ago, and they should have acted on it. So they should be terrified. Their model is going to be torn apart. Should we be fearful about our structures of community, of government, of governance, of law? We should be fearful of all of those things. Should we be fearful about inequity and inequality? We certainly should, because the most likely outcome is that some people will be radically enabled by these new technologies and others will be left behind by them. But we already are. This is kind of an acceleration or amplification of where we already are. If we're dominated by fear, we will build fortifications. But I suspect the battlefield, if you like, the landscape of conflict here is fluid and multidimensional. And to build a fortification in one space, for example, through regulation or control, is to lose the broader conflict. We will lose if we seek to be static in our defense. That much is very clear.
Interesting. So when you hear governments and regulators talking about AI, things like the European AI Act, things like that they're looking to implement in the US, what do you think of the approaches around that? Are they regulating for the old world? Are they trying to preserve the old world? Or are they, trying to minimize risk? Or what approach do you think there is? There a status quo preservation element to it that, because lobby groups represent the historical basis rather than the future?
Yeah, it's interesting because you kind of need both. So, I often say organizations and our structures of society are built to persist. They are built to be in conflict and contested and not to change on a whim. We shouldn't have a system of law that changes on Tuesday because somebody had a great idea. We shouldn't have a system of finance and banking regulation which shifts next week because somebody builds a new app. It's supposed to be really difficult to change things. However, it shouldn't be impossible. Now, I suspect that what we need is regulation which keeps us safe within the legacy model, but we also need space to engage in the sharpest edges of change, because history teaches us that innovation and greed will outstrip that kind of legislation. So, my rather bleak prediction when people say, what do you think the near future will look like is very clear. I say, a few people will make a ton of money at the expense of a lot of others. That's very clear. That's how our system is set up, so we shouldn't be in denial about that. So if our regulation leaves us at a competitive disadvantage or leaves us sub-optimized in a rapidly changing space, we may stay safe, but we will be smaller. We will
Yeah.
be outcompeted. And you see this, how the US is struggling or fighting for this at the moment. It's like, will we use AI as competitive advantage, or will we somehow hold back? And because if we know that those who work against us will use it in an unconstrained way, then if we don't build the knowledge and capability, we are simply outcompeted. And competition is a funny thing because it doesn't really have ethics or morality
Yeah.
or commonly agreed goals and start lines and finish lines. So it's very clear that AI radically upsets, creates asymmetry, disruption, and fracture in many of the systems which we are used to either being stable or controllable, or at least knowable. So we know that that is the case. The field that we are playing on is breaking apart. We know that the pace of change is extremely fast. And we know with absolute certainty that AI does not just let us do more of what we did before, but faster and better. It will let us do things in fundamentally different ways. And as a result of this, it will allow us to do fundamentally new things, and it will make redundant many of the structures and systems, technologies, and structures of power and identity that came before. Now, if we don't give ourselves, if we surround ourselves with so much fear, security, regulation, confidence, and certainty that we are unable to see that, let alone adapt to it, then we will be in a very difficult place indeed.
Yeah. There's a great quote in your book that says the half-life of culture is contracting. Uh, and if you think about from our world, the culture that law enforcement and national security are worried about is it can be on the negative side, on the criminality side. So that culture must be contracting as well, because they have to be, leveraging generative AI as well as everybody else. What are you seeing from that side of the world where people are putting it to bad use in criminality, organized crime, cyber threat, etc.? I presume what you're seeing in the world is what we're seeing, is that this is another tool of the trade.
Yeah, it's a tool of the trade, and it's a tool within a new trade. So that sort of fundamentally what we're seeing is, I'll sort of try this out. Remember that my work is exploratory and often sits in the creation of new language, finding new
Yeah.
ways to talk about things. So let me sort of try that out with you. The if we look historically, much of our change sat in the creation of things. So a printing press. Why do we have a publishing industry? Well, it's because somebody invented a printing press, but the printing press was expensive and complicated, and you had to learn how to lay out the text. And so to print a book was a business to be taken seriously, not only because it cost a lot of time, it was essentially an investment of risk in terms of money, but it was also an investment of risk in terms of the ideas, because by printing you could scale ideas. So the printing industry, the same as the music industry or any other industry, was really about sort of the control of the tools of the infrastructure. And similarly, there was a thread you could follow through conflict, which was about the production of things, be they sort of tanks or roads or warships, production of things which were expensive and tangible and weighed a ton and had to be moved around. Now, what AI does is it takes some of that and it makes those tools kind of infinitely replicable and essentially free. So what we've seen in the sort of knowledge and information space, we now see proliferating beyond that. So when we look at disinformation, the cost of disinformation has plummeted, and our systems of resilience against it are simply outclassed, outdated. And it's not only our systems, it's our cognition. So our filters, this is something we look at in the book, our things slip by our filter. So we still talk to people who say, I can tell what's spam because it uses strange grammar. Well, sure, you can spot spam which uses strange grammar, but you can't spot it if it sounds like your mum writing you a letter.
That's right.
And this is our certainty, like what is art, what is good, what is true. Well, I just know it. So this notion of things slipping past our filters, the notion of proliferation, requires us to reassess how our safety is held and what kind of conflict we are in. Because by one measure, we are kind of already at war in this information space, in the identity space. But you have to look at that in a broader sense that says, but what if the fundamental structures themselves are changing? So if people are increasingly belonging to new community structures, meta-tribal structures, global structures, brand structures, celebrity structures, if our identities are shifting and changing, we may find that we are in conflict within a formal system that is itself diminishing, but we're also very connected and liberated in other spaces. And that's why I feel strongly you have to look at both sides of this at the same time. I know that's a very imperfect answer.
Yeah,
but
no, it's interesting because it brings me on to the whole notion of trust, right? Where where we got our news, you used to always trust the news. Where you had acknowledged experts, they were the acknowledged experts. Now everybody's got an opinion. People don't trust news, but if you've got a lot of generative content out there, that's going to be very confusing for people. And you mentioned identity, so expand on that in terms of where identity fits in this world of such fracture, such change.
yeah, it's really interesting. So my work's research based, but it's also speculative. And I was talking to my son about science. He's 6 years old, and we went to a science fair. He was very excited about it, and he suddenly became very interested in. Because I said to him, "Oh, I'm a scientist," and he was like, "Oh, what kind of scientists are you?" I was like, "Well, various different types, but essentially a social scientist. So that's like science, but not quite as
Yeah.
rigorous." So it's one of the research projects I did a couple of years ago was about identity, the Identity Project, just interviewing people in great depth about the identities that they hold and how they're held. And it gave me, I mentioned earlier about creating language, vocabulary, it created this idea of the unreconciled self, because those people described lots of different identities held in different spaces, but they're never pulled together. We never sort of sit down on Friday afternoon and say, who was I this week? Who was I with my family, with my friends, in an argument, in a conference? We never sort of put it together and say, this is who I am right now. We just tend to hold these diverse identities. Now, our radical connectivity, that context of the social age, allows us to do that. Plenty of people hold different identities, exploratory identities. They are able to explore who they are. They're able to hold subsets of themselves in safe spaces. Those subsets may be good or bad, depending on our viewpoint on that. But people are able to explore extreme ideas and fantastic ideas. But the reality is that we are unreconciled. We are fragmented and splintered, and nobody gets to see the whole thing. So that is interesting at a sort of cognitive level. It allows us to explore these different aspects. And unmoderated, either by ourselves or by others or by systems or by legislation, it of course allows extreme views and ideas to proliferate. So identity is something we're looking at in depth in the new book. It is something which is more complex than we may imagine. It's not fixed, it's fluid, and it's this multi-layered and can be contested. That's a strange thing. I can be one self here and another self here, and they would be in conflict with each other, but we somehow are able to hold it unreconciled. Now, trust, I looked at trust a few years ago, 2018, 2019, in a large-scale research project with about 70,000 people, and I published 2 books out of that. And it's not a thing. That's the first thing to say. Trust is not a thing. It's a judgment that we make about each other, about our systems. we, in any given moment, we look down at this basket that we hold full of the context and all the forces acting upon us, and we say, yeah, right now in this context, I trust this person or this thing in this way. But because trust is a judgment and an investment, we come to, it's not an absolute thing. So we can hold trust in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways and weird and terrible ways. And that's a mistake that we often make. We talk about trust as if it is sort of good or bad, but it just is. It's a mechanism of social cohesion, and it's vital. We can't
Yeah.
exist without it. It's not good or bad. It just is, and it's powerful. And when you look at that, you start to see how these social structures, our tribes, our trust bonded structures, how they form and how they can become very diverse, and how our identities can be held across multiple of those different structures. And that's something of the landscape we're inhabiting today, whether we're talking about creativity or we're talking about defense and security or law enforcement. We are dealing with people who are now more complex and spread out than they ever used to be.
Yeah.
Our fundamental relationship with the local and the visible and the certain has dissolved. And now it's much more complex than that. And we have to find ways to survive and thrive in this new landscape.
Yeah, fascinating. And if you think about identity, where people are maintaining multiple identities themselves, but then there's people in the criminal world that are intentionally creating new identities all the time through their own deep fakes, through, trying to impersonate. There's a lot of scare stories happening now about, chief financial officers being impersonated because they've got access to payment systems, voice through authentication of people and payments is under attack. The whole, what people trust when they go online is changing because there's so much new content happening there as well, isn't there?
Absolutely. I remember talking to somebody wished me happy birthday a couple of years ago, and I said, "Oh, it's not my birthday, it's my internet birthday." And they said, "Really, what on earth do you mean?" I was like, "Well, that's my internet birthday. It's not my real one. I never use my real one." And they were just like, "What? Why don't you?" And I was like, "Why don't you?" We were just both like completely incomprehensible of each other's position, and that's where we are. It's not just that something that we used to know was true. Somebody sends me an email, writes me a letter. I essentially took it to be true, and now essentially I have to take it to be untrue. It's a fundamental shift. There's never coming back. There's never going to be a way of reimposing our certainty about truth and trust and identity in this new world. We'll have to find new mechanisms to quantify, to codify, to calibrate within this. And that level of change, that's what's really challenging to our systems, many of which, let's be honest, are woefully behind the times. Like they're not just a little bit out of kilter, they are completely left behind by this pace. We're often dealing with government systems which have taken 30 years to digitize, and having done so, they've digitized and are not connected. The idea that somehow these systems are going to protect us against a world where you can create 1,000, 100,000 identities, which are dialogic, which are infinitely adaptable and contextualizable. That's insane. We're never going to be able to protect. A defensive stance like that is not going to keep us safe.
Right. So that's a good segue then into what can the law enforcement, the security, the defense world do in this world? Obviously they've got legacy systems, they've got finite budget. The world seems to have infinite budget for generative AI, and people are using it. OpenAI, I think, is the fastest growing consumer product of all time, 700 million users. So a good percentage of the world's population is using one particular product, right? So the scale that they're facing, what can they do? They can't give up, right? They still have to engage, participate, protect. What do you say to them if you're sitting on front of heads of police forces in any Western country today?
Well, again, I'm not sure I could say anything very insightful on this, but I suppose the key things in my mind are this. We have to understand that if we are carrying out the fight on an island which is being inundated, sooner or later we're going to drown. We have to adapt how we are carrying that fight. Most likely, it will require us to build an idea of what's fundamentally essential and what can be changed or challenged and what's new and emergent. So some things we absolutely need to focus on how we hold on to them. Our structures of democracy and sort of trust in those systems, if we live in a democratic state, are going to be important to us. Probably our structures of justice and fairness are going to be important to us. We will have to consider what those things are and how we hold them. Some stuff we're going to have to be more fluid around. We're going to have to decide what we can do, and that ties into a truth about policing and about security anyway. That there is the absolute thing and there is the belief in the thing. So here in the UK, what we see is that many people feel that law enforcement is trusted less and that we are less safe and secure than we were. But we don't think that because of some grand and overarching narrative. We just think it because we haven't seen many police officers on the street recently. We don't see as many police cars driving past, or we heard about somebody that that got robbed when they went to London. It's very immediate and local.
Yeah.
But it's very real. It's belief, but policing doesn't work because we truly do have enough resources for everybody to be safe. It's because there is a belief that we should. So we have to sort of find the spaces which are important to protect, find the spaces where we can evolve. And of course, the big interest is around how we move towards more whole of society approaches. So if we have policing and defence within sort of formal budgeted structures, we probably also need to create more holistic and interconnected structures, which will require us also to trade in trust, a thing which is largely lacking. And I think that's very interesting. Approaches to whole of society security and interconnection offer all sorts of benefits, but all sorts of challenges as well. And I guess that would be the thing I would say. The truth is that we may have to ride through that valley before we find our safety and certainty, such as it is. That AI is not an aberration. It's not an irritation on the edge of an overall stable system. It has fundamentally fractured the system. It may have entirely abstracted the system. So it will require bold thinking. And I did some work on experimentation and failure in large commercial organizations. One thing that became very clear was that the more senior you are, the less permission you have to fail and the less ability you have to be uncertain. And that's crazy. We've created institutions where on day one, you can ask anything you like. Where are the toilets? Where do I hang my coat? How does the entire thing work? When you're in charge, you can ask almost nothing. And you can certainly not stand up and say, I'm not sure. Or worse, I said this with confidence last week, and I want to say something different with confidence today. Yeah. You'd be ridiculed and judged and hounded out. And that's crazy. It creates systems where the decisions are made on the basis they will persist, sometimes for years. Budgetary cycles are run on the belief that they will persist. But the world is changing so fast. We need to create that middle space. So space of certainty, the things we must defend. Space of curiosity, the things that we may need to evolve, must evolve. And then a space of emergence. We need to remain open to this, to new tools, to new ideas, to new approaches, to new belief systems, and understand within all of that how the landscape is changing. So the idea to hold on to for me is that it's not just change within a system, it is change of the system. We can't abandon our attempts to hold security and safety within the system as it is, but neither can we ignore that we have to document, explore, and learn about that fundamental change in the system. We have to do both of those things in parallel, and our budgets and resourcing should reflect that challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting. You remind me of why people say NASA would never have invented a rocket that could land itself, whereas SpaceX had the space and opportunity to make all those mistakes because NASA had to be more certain. You build a couple of rockets, you blew them all up. What are you getting wrong? Whereas SpaceX had the freedom to keep blowing up things until they got it right.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I 6 years ago, I wrote a book about the Apollo missions. It's called To the Moon, and I mainly did that so that I could tell my son that that's what I did for a living, draw spaceships, and a lot of fun. And I wanted to write that, and it's developed into a body of work that I do in a program I teach about failure, complexity, and control. And it looks essentially at the shape of complexity, the systems of complexity we inhabit, the nature of failure and how it's imposed upon us, and how we seek to control it and what we seek to control. And there are interesting things within that. So the first is, NASA maintained very high safety standards. So, to this day, the Americans have never lost an astronaut in space, although there have been deaths on the ground, of course, and famously the Apollo 1 fire. Things like the Apollo 1 fire are really interesting because it was an entirely understood system that the failure happened within. So we imagine that the Apollo program, to create one of the most complex machines ever created by humans, imagine that much of it was about discovery of the new, invention of the new. But the fire was caused by something that was incredibly well understood. If you have oxygen at high pressure and you have a spark, it will catch fire. There's no magic in that. There was no mystery in that. Everybody knew that. Because everybody knew it, there was no, and so everybody knew the system was unsafe and didn't have to be. The ground tests, which is where the fire happened, could have taken place with an inert atmosphere. They were just done with oxygen, but nobody spoke up. Nobody said, I think we should do it differently. If you look at the Challenger disaster, the space shuttle disaster, the first one, we see again that we had a system of safety which steamrolled over the engineers which knew better. The system was designed to get a go or no go decision, but really it has a laser focus on those individuals to say go. To say don't go would have carried huge cost and consequence.
Right.
So the system delivered exactly what it was supposed to deliver, and the outcome was failure. And what this I think teaches us is that systems alone will not make us safe. We have to have an ability that some organizations hold, which is to hear weak voices. We need a social sense-making capability to hear weak voices and to move into dialogue around them, even when they are in conflict with the things that we know are true with our absolute certainty. So essentially, the fundamental capability, if I was talking to somebody running an organization, as you described today, a police force, security, defense force, I would be saying the fundamental capability we need are firstly, to be kinetic, to do stuff. And secondly, to hold and process ambiguity, not in service of killing it, but in service of holding it. It's an asset. It's a resource. Our ambiguity, to get into it, to feed it, to make it as big as possible, and to develop the sense-making structures around that, the social sense-making and the technological sense-making structures around that. The bigger the space we can create, with the more weird and wonderful ideas, a junkyard of stuff, the more likely we are to be able to create what we need when we need to create it. So as it becomes clear in some way, we will have the resource to hand. We'll have we'll have the junk and we'll have the capability to create not one answer but multiple answers and to rapidly prototype them, to do something with it. And that to me feels important. Stability, security, certainty here, but this ability to rapidly prototype, to fail, to learn, to change. We need that as well. So this is why it's both. We need what we
Yeah.
had before. We need something new. We need less. What we had before has to have less power and less control. And what we create can't take things over, or it'll be anarchy. So our leadership capability is to hold a dynamic tension in a time of change and to recognize that the tension is an asset. We must hold it and build it, not seek to control it and kill it.
Interesting. That's fascinating because that's where the work we do with governments is applying AI to helping them with that ambiguity, right? Because then you're coming at it from a sociology point of view. How do you actually embrace the ambiguity rather than get rid of it? Which back to my old world, I come from the financial services world where it was always about killing ambiguity, but that's where the financial crisis came from. Is the quiet voices weren't listened to because the answer was predetermined. We're going to take that risk and make more money. Whereas this is what you're talking about here is talking about safety in the terms of ambiguity and decision intelligence in terms of ambiguity. And yeah, I would agree with you. I think generative AI is a big part to play there in terms of linking all these things together that were never linked.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a funny thing. I said to you before we started, I've been on holiday. I was in a campsite at a festival a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to someone. I met someone, and we were chatting. And she's a single mother, runs her own business, turns over about £750 a month, which to many people is nothing, almost nothing. But we were just chatting, and I said, "Oh, how do you do your tax returns? You optimize what you do?" And she said, "Oh, no, I do my self-assessment. I can't afford an accountant." And so we sat down and we just used AI to talk about this, to say, I run a small business, £750 a month. These are my outgoings. Her big decision was that she runs her business. She needs a room in her house to run her business, and she drives 200 miles a week to run it. And she was debating about whether to move house, have a bigger house with an extra room that would cost her an extra couple of £100 a month. We spent an hour just running through that, and it gave her a really good answer that would save her, or probably directly increase her income by about 20% a year, which is a lot of money, if you earn a small amount like that. And it doesn't get much more real than that. So, in all of our big sort of conversations about AI and whether it's a threat, what it will change, what will persist, for many people, it's just going to be great. Now, great at what they want, because we could easily have spent that hour saying, how are we going to subvert or break something or distress somebody? We didn't. Just used it to, to do something that would make somebody's life a bit better. And it's that kind of tool. It's like the ultimate Swiss Army knife. You can just use it to do all sorts of things. It's dialogic. It's easy. It helps you do better. It creates things that are really tangibly useful, be that a piece of art to stick on your wall, or be that a story for your 6-year-old, or be that better planning for retirement. It just creates stuff. So that's why I say the landscape is different.
Yeah.
Our willingness to let things go is going to be just as important as our ability to grab hold of exciting and shiny new things, to let go of some of the things which, if we're not careful, will just strangle us as we're trying to move.
And if you think of the culture then of organizations, and what you're talking about is very radical for most organizations. It's a big change. It's it's letting go of central control. It's distributing into the organization. Particularly when when we think of investigations, they're looking for certainty. They're not looking for ambiguity. They're looking for things that will stand up in court, right? And not just from the technology point of view, but from the culture point of view. How, for people to hypothesize and create theories and then defend them. Do you think that organizations are ready for this, or what can they do to get ready for that kind of a dialogue with a computer, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously carrying us into very deep waters with this question. So
Yeah.
the first thing is, it's it's not my fault if organizations are swamped by circumstance. That's what I would say. So it's like, it's not that I want you to be swamped, it just is. If the world changes around you, it's nobody's fault, it just is. So at the broadest level, in the work I do around organizational change and societal change, I say maybe we've just outlived the format of organization we have. There's some pretty good insight that would indicate that maybe we need organizations that are more disposable, are more transient. We do need something that we're connected to throughout our lives, systems of education, of infrastructure, of belonging, of security, of identity, but they may not be the things that came before. So it may be that we need organizations that are more disposable. And many of our new organizations are smaller, more technologically facilitated. We're seeing some of the fundamental shifts, like decline in belief and organized religions, and the increase in celebrity, the globalization of culture. These are really fundamental things that are shifting. When you sort of take it down a level, what are the things that we really need? Well, optimization, efficiency and optimization using new technologies will allow us to do some of the things you're talking about better and faster. But they then come into conflict sometimes with how social attitudes are changing. And we see that in the UK at the moment. There's plenty of conflict between methods of policing and models of the sort of social evolution of beliefs and ideas, polluted by disinformation. So it's very tricky. How do we police in an evolving social context and an increasingly globalized and hyper-connected social context? So again, it's, if I'm being tactical, I normally say so tactical is years 1 to 3 and strategic is years 3 to 5 and beyond. At the tactical level, we just need to create structures of exploration. We have to be sketching our own map. We have to know what's going on. We have to recognize that if we've heard something 3 times, we don't need to hear it again. Where do you find your communities of difference and dissent? Where do you find different ideas? Where can you let your certainty go? Where are your spaces for dialogue within the organization? How can you lead with difference and dissent? I teach a really fun, I really like it, a short program on disorientation and imperfection, which says, okay, we spend most of our time needing to be absolutely certain and not break stuff. But how would we use a lens of disorientation actively rather than waiting till we're knocked off kilter? How would we deliberately unfocus things? How would we use this notion of imperfection to explore possible alternative ideas? And people are generally not short of ideas. The people that you have are probably the people that can save you if we can create those spaces and opportunities and give people the individual and collective tools in order to do so. So it's a bit of a combination. Short term, tactically, we need to use the new technologies in the right way, but build these new structures of exploration. Longer term, more strategically, we need to fundamentally reevaluate. And the first place this is likely to come to view is in the strategic AI workshops I'm running at the moment. We talk about this anthropotechnic view, that most people don't want computer robot overlords. Most people don't want to be in denial and say, let's just ban everything.
Yeah.
So we kind of want a hybrid model. And we talk about the AI on the board or the AI in court, but what we haven't really tackled is how are we going to feel when we discover that the AI is better at the leadership piece than we are? So resource allocation, task allocation, performance management, the whole farce of performance management in organizations and psychometrics in organizations, it's terribly inefficient, terribly
ineffective.
Not a fan now. I would say not. how will we feel when we have a system which will say there's a task that needs to be done? You've been here 20 years, you're the most senior person in the room, but the graduate's better at it than you. And I'm
Yeah.
giving the job to the graduate. That's the challenge we'll be facing in very short order. And if we don't address it, we'll be outcompeted.
Interesting. And finally, Julian, if there was one technology capability, real or imagined, that you'd give an investigator today that to make their job easier, to actually meet the expectation they have of themselves and the organization has of them, what would it be? If you're a king for a day, what's the technology you'd give? The investigator, the people responsible for keeping us safe?
So I think I would invent a technology which allows us to see our certainty within a broader context. I think anything which allows us to recognize that something we believe is true and we're certain about is sometimes a construct. I think that would be useful because, of course, in an investigation we need certainty and we need an outcome. But there is, when we create our truth, we build a wall and it's so high and so wide that sometimes we forget that it's a wall at all. It becomes entirely invisible to us because it encompasses us. And we know that systems can be overwhelmed by momentum. So just a tool which would allow us to see our certainty as this beautiful, clear line,
Yeah.
but along that line to say, where is our assumption? Where is the ambiguity? Where is the change? I think that'd be useful, a kind of heat map of certainty. That would be useful. I guess you asked me earlier about fear, and what I should have said was, I'm an optimist, but I'm not an idealist. I recognise that I'm an optimist, so sometimes I can counter it. So I suppose the other thing I would say is that even when we are stretched and when we're under pressure and when things are changing so fast, we should probably also, if we had a technology which could allow us to hold on to compassion within this, it would be no bad thing. And I don't say that naively. There's no point in defending a social system if it loses its sense of compassion. There's no point in protecting the system. If we wish to inhabit a civil society, we have to ensure that it is civil. And at times we lose that. And then I think we run the risk of delaminating our sort of aspects of justice and truth from community and belonging, and that's risky. There's no point in having perfect justice if we lose compassion and civility in the process. We have to find ways of doing that.
Balance. Interesting, because you remind me of a conversation I had with a customer where they were saying one of the benefits of using our technology is that they get to more certainty around truth. And that how, we were thinking just for the investigator, they were explaining to me, no, it helps in the whole criminal justice life cycle, because if they have a higher confidence of truth in a prosecution, that goes to a prosecutor, they're more confident, it goes to the defense. The defense will encourage their client to plead guilty quicker. Then the victim doesn't have to relitigate in court. And then they end up with a shorter sentence. So everybody wins when there's more certainty around truth. So I really like your answer on that, and the ability to have more confidence in the truth of an investigation. But Julian, it's been a fascinating conversation, and thank you for your time, and look forward to following your work in the future. Thanks for joining us on Siren Investigates.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me along.